There's a strange kind of silence that follows every empire at its peak. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of forgetting. Picture it. The year is 1566. The Ottoman Empire stands as the most powerful civilization on earth. From the deserts of Arabia to the gates of Vienna, its reach touches 3 continents. Sultans rule from marble palaces that glow under candlelight. Gold flows through Istanbul's markets like a river that will never dry. Scholars, poets, traders, all believe they are living in a world that will never end. And maybe that's how every golden age begins to die. Not with a fall, but with the illusion that the rise is eternal. Because underneath the silk and the calligraphy, something else is beginning to grow. Not rebellion, not invasion, debt. The Ottomans once built their empire on discipline. The first sultans, men like Osman and Orhan, lived almost like soldiers. Their tents were simple, their meals were modest. The empire was guided by a belief that power comes from restraint, that greatness survives only when appetite is controlled. But as the centuries passed, that discipline softened. Generations born into luxury began to confuse wealth with strength and comfort with success. Sound familiar? The same pattern that haunts every empire, from Rome to Spain, from Britain to America, was now writing its verses in Ottoman ink. Luxury isn't just about gold and marble. It's about the psychology of permanence. The moment you start believing that prosperity is natural, you stop protecting the roots that created it. By the late 1500s, the Ottoman palace was no longer a symbol of resilience. It had become a mirror, reflecting excess. The imperial court spent fortunes on silks from Italy, spices from India, perfumes from Egypt. Art became ornament. Ornament became identity, and the empire that once supplied the world now depended on it. But here's the twist. The Ottomans didn't collapse because of enemies at the gates. They decayed because their economy began serving desire instead of discipline. To fund wars, the state began borrowing, not just from its provinces, but from foreign lenders. Interest crept in like rot under a painted floor. The empire of faith and order was quietly becoming a debtor. And once you start owing your future to others, you stop owning it. Across the centuries, you can almost feel the pattern breathing. Rome's gold debased, Spain's silver inflated, France's debt exploded, and now the Ottomans, the longest of them all, were whispering the same warning. The story of the Ottoman decline is not about battles lost, it's about values traded. When an empire replaces its purpose with pleasure and its productivity with borrowing, its fate is already decided. The body might still look alive, but the soul has already signed the contract. And yet, that's what makes their story haunting. Because they didn't just lose power, they lost perspective. The same empire that had once been feared for its unity now drowned in internal divisions. The palace versus the army, the ministers versus the merchants, the faith versus the finance. And through it all, one question hung in the air like a ghost. Can wealth ever be permanent when it's built on borrowed desire? We'll see how the answer unfolds, from the rise of harem politics to the foreign debt traps that would eventually sell the empire's sovereignty piece by piece. But before we go deeper into the fall, you need to understand why the Ottomans thought they were unbreakable. Because that illusion, the same one nations, corporations, and even individuals still carry today, is the real beginning of every downfall. At first, it looked like the peak of civilization. The Ottoman capital shimmered like a dream made solid, domes glinting under the sun, caravans pouring in from every horizon, the scent of spice and silk floating through the air. The empire had money, trade, and prestige. But beneath that gold surface, a quiet fracture had begun. The wealth that once symbolized strength had started to feed weakness. When power becomes routine, it breeds comfort. And comfort is the first sedative of vigilance. The early Ottomans understood this instinctively. Their leaders were trained warriors, their lives shaped by scarcity and uncertainty. But by the 17th century, that spirit had softened. Princes grew up in palaces, not battlefields. The sword had been replaced by ceremony, and the same luxury that dazzled outsiders was quietly dissolving the empire from within. There's something about comfort that rewires ambition. When generations inherit wealth they didn't earn, they begin to believe that prosperity is their birthright. The empire's administrators, once chosen for merit, now climbed through influence, family, and favor. Corruption became perfume, invisible but everywhere. Gold wasn't scarce anymore, it was worshipped. And worship is the most dangerous form of blindness. The palace turned inward. Instead of strategists, poets, and generals debating the empire's next move, the halls echoed with gossip, intrigue, and pleasure. The harem politics, the invisible court within the court, became the real center of power. Decisions about trade routes, taxes, and wars were often shaped not by ministers, but by whispers from behind silk curtains. For a time, it still worked. The machine was large enough to keep running, even as its gears began to rust. The Ottoman treasury swelled with silver from the New World and taxes from its vast territories. But something fundamental had changed. The empire had gone from creating value to consuming it. It's a shift that every civilization eventually faces, when the hunger that built it turns into appetite for display. The same dynamic plays out in modern economies too. When wealth compounds faster than work, societies begin to consume symbols of success instead of producing its substance. In Istanbul, the market once filled with local craftsmanship now overflowed with imported luxuries. Venetian glass, Persian carpets, Indian jewels, all purchased with borrowed silver. The empire that once set trends was now chasing them. And when an empire starts copying what it used to inspire, it's already in decline. The Ottomans' dependency on imported goods created a trade imbalance that drained precious metals from the treasury. To fix that, the state debased its coinage, mixing copper with silver, quietly inflating the money supply. Prices rose, wages stagnated, and trust in currency began to crack. Sound familiar? Every inflation crisis in history, from Weimar Germany to modern fiat collapse, begins with the same arrogance, the belief that value can be printed without consequence. The Ottoman administrators didn't call it inflation, they called it adjustment. But peasants, merchants, and soldiers felt the truth in their stomachs long before they saw it on paper. Bread got smaller, pay came late, taxes rose, and as people's faith in the system weakened, so did their loyalty. Revolts began to spark in distant provinces. Not grand revolutions, just small acts of defiance, protests over unpaid salaries, mutinies over food shortages. These were the early warning signs, the pulse of a dying empire pretending to be alive. Yet the elite didn't notice. They couldn't. They were too deep inside their own reflection. Historians later called this period the Age of Tulips, when the Ottoman aristocracy obsessed over gardens, parties, and European fashions, while their empire's foundation quietly cracked. Tulips, fragile, beautiful, and expensive, became the perfect metaphor for what the empire had become. A society intoxicated by aesthetics, bankrupt in discipline. The Ottoman Golden Veil wasn't just luxury, it was an illusion. A civilization mistaking movement for progress, glitter for glory, credit for creation. And every time history repeats, it whispers the same warning. Prosperity without purpose is the most elegant form of decay. The Ottoman elite didn't know it yet, but their empire was living on borrowed time, and soon on borrowed money. The next stage of their story wouldn't be about excess, it would be about debt, and how invisible interest can enslave even the mighty. By the 18th century, the empire that once funded itself through conquest and trade was now funding its survival through loans. Debt, once considered dishonorable, even unthinkable, had become routine. What began as temporary borrowing to cover wars and deficits slowly turned into a permanent addiction. The Ottomans didn't fall because they borrowed once. They fell because borrowing became culture. Every time the treasury ran dry, the empire turned not inward for reform, but outward for credit. Europe, once the humbled student of Ottoman grandeur, had now become the teacher of finance. London, Paris, and Vienna were the new banks of empire, and Istanbul their most desperate client. For centuries, the Ottoman strength came from independence, the ability to fund its ambitions without begging for foreign approval. But now, every war, every palace project, every trade agreement had a silent cost, interest. The empire was no longer selling silk or spice, it was selling time. The early sultans had built their empire on a code of faith, that debt was a form of bondage. He who borrows, an old Ottoman proverb warned, sells his freedom for a coin. Yet by the 1800s, that warning was buried under ledgers and signatures written in foreign languages. The empire began mortgaging its own future, one bond at a time. European financiers called it modernization, but in truth it was a dependency with a polite accent. When the Crimean War broke out in the 1850s, the Ottomans borrowed heavily from British and French banks to fund their army. The war ended, but the payments didn't. Loans rolled into new loans. Interest payments consumed more of the budget than education, infrastructure, or reform. The empire was trapped in a spiral. Each attempt to fix the past only deepened the future's debt. And, like every addict, it began lying to itself. Ministers insisted that the empire was simply adapting to the modern economy. They said borrowing was temporary, that growth would catch up. But history doesn't care for promises. It counts results. Within decades, half of the empire's revenues were pledged to foreign creditors. The Ottoman economy, once the beating heart of the Mediterranean, was now a hostage to European bankers. And what's haunting is how familiar this pattern sounds today. Nations, corporations, even individuals, all repeating the same ritual, borrowing against tomorrow to avoid the pain of today. The language changes. Stimulus, credit expansion, fiscal easing. But the psychology is ancient. The belief that debt, if managed well enough, is not danger but power. The Ottomans believed it too, until the bill arrived. In 1875, the inevitable happened. The Ottoman government defaulted. For the first time in its 600-year history, the empire declared bankruptcy. The symbol of Islamic and imperial power now had to ask permission from European powers to manage its own money. The Ottoman Public Debt Administration was created, a foreign-controlled institution that took over tax collection to pay European creditors directly. Imagine that. The taxes of Ottoman citizens being collected not for their own empire, but for bankers in London and Paris. The empire hadn't just lost control of its finances, it had lost its sovereignty. Debt had done what no army could, conquered the empire from within. The moral is clear and universal. Empires rarely die in battle, they die in contracts, not through invasion, but through interest. When the flow of money becomes more important than the flow of meaning, decline becomes destiny. What makes this tragedy even sharper is how preventable it was. The empire's intellectuals and reformers warned of the danger. They called for new industries, education, and internal accountability. But reform takes time, and debt offers immediacy. And humans, whether sultans or citizens, always choose the comfort of now over the discipline of later. By the time the Ottoman court realized what had happened, they were no longer negotiating with bankers. They were obeying them. The empire had become a case study in the most elegant form of conquest, financial colonization. No soldiers, no blood, just signatures, interest rates, and time. The Ottomans had built their empire with swords and lost it with pens. And in that loss lies one of history's most dangerous illusions, that debt can be controlled. But in truth, debt never serves. It rules. And when it begins to rule the state, the people soon follow. By the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire still looked vast on a map, stretching across the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Europe. But that map was a memory, not a mirror. Behind the flags and titles, real power was evaporating. The empire had become what every aging power eventually becomes, an actor performing the role of strength while negotiating behind the curtain for permission to continue the act. Its palaces still glittered. Its officials still spoke of destiny and glory. But every decree, every reform, every show of confidence was now an echo of what used to be. This is the most deceptive stage of decline, the moment when collapse hides behind ceremony. The Ottoman court knew the world was changing, but it couldn't change with it. Reforms were announced almost yearly, each one promising revival. New schools, new armies, new bureaucracies. But the soul of the system remained unchanged. Corruption persisted. Nepotism thrived. Every new institution became a mirror of the old one. It's what happens when a state reforms its surface, but not its spirit. The empire's military, once the fear of Europe, had become a stage army, parading in uniforms imported from Paris while marching with weapons bought on credit. Soldiers looked strong, but their pay was months late. Commanders gave speeches about honor while selling supplies to survive. The performance of power had replaced power itself, and the public, exhausted and cynical, began to see through the illusion. In the markets of Istanbul, merchants whispered about the empire's debts. In villages, tax collectors came not as servants of the Sultan, but as agents of foreign creditors. Faith in leadership, once unshakable, was replaced by quiet resentment. People still bowed to the empire's symbols, but not to its spirit. History teaches a painful truth. Institutions don't collapse when people stop believing in them. They collapse when people still pretend to. The Ottoman Empire was now living on reputation alone. It had become the shadow of its former self, proud of its past but paralyzed by its present. And yet, even then, there were moments of brilliance, attempts to modernize, to reclaim dignity. The Tanzimat reforms sought to secularize law, expand education, and centralize administration. But every attempt to clean the system was sabotaged by the very interests it threatened. Bureaucrats clung to privilege, elites feared accountability, and foreign powers preferred a weak Ottoman state they could control over a strong one they couldn't. It's one of history's cruelest patterns. External pressure alone doesn't destroy an empire. Internal cowardice finishes the job. The sultans became more like managers than monarchs, balancing debt repayments with palace expenses, pleasing creditors abroad while pacifying factions at home. Diplomacy replaced leadership. The empire's rulers spent more time in European capitals, negotiating loans and concessions, than in their own provinces, listening to their people. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Ottoman state was technically alive but spiritually empty. It had institutions, armies, and laws, but no trust, no unity, no purpose. And when a nation loses those, it becomes easy to manipulate. Europe didn't need to invade the Ottoman Empire. It simply waited. Each crisis, a war, a famine, a rebellion, gave them new opportunities to step in to help, always with conditions attached. Railroads, ports, industries, all financed by foreign investors who demanded control as collateral. Bit by bit, sovereignty was traded for stability and freedom for financing. The empire was not destroyed, it was absorbed. A slow erosion disguised as partnership. And through it all, the Ottomans held on to one last illusion. That identity alone could save them. That being the caliphate, the leader of the Muslim world, would somehow shield them from modern economics, politics, and reality. But identity without adaptability is nostalgia. The world had changed. The industrial age had redrawn the rules, and the Ottomans were still playing a medieval game. They had the symbols of power, but not the systems. They had the image of unity, but not the structure. They had pride, but no plan. And that's how empires die quietly, not in chaos, but in performance. A slow surrender disguised as continuity. The empire didn't crumble in a single moment. It dissolved in slow motion over decades of polite denial. By the time the 20th century began, the Ottoman sun was setting. And just beyond that horizon, a new world was already rising. A world of nation-states, industry, and modern finance that would soon decide who inherited what was left of the empire's shadow. When decline stretches long enough, it begins to feel like stability. That's what made the final century of the Ottoman Empire so deceptive. From a distance, it still looked majestic. Calligraphic flags, grand mosques, sultans in ornate robes invoking divine legitimacy. But inside, the structure was hollow. Identity had become performance, faith had become politics, and survival had replaced purpose. The empire still called itself the protector of Islam, but it couldn't protect itself from its creditors. It still called itself a caliphate, but it couldn't even hold its own provinces together. What was once spiritual authority had turned into political branding. A mirage meant to hold a fragmented population in emotional orbit, while the state quietly disintegrated. The sultans leaned on religion as their last defense, using faith not as inspiration but as insulation. Sermons spoke of divine favor, of destiny, of enemies plotting against the believers. But the real enemy wasn't outside. It was the system's refusal to change. Faith became a tool to preserve the old order, not renew it. And every time reformers tried to challenge that, whether intellectuals, soldiers, or politicians, they were silenced in the name of unity. The empire was trapped in a paradox. It needed change to survive, but change threatened those who ruled. So it did what decaying systems always do. It wrapped itself in nostalgia. "We are still the heirs of greatness," they said. "We still carry the light of civilization." And maybe they did once, but light, when not tended, becomes memory. The 19th century had turned into a century of humiliation. Territory after territory slipped away. Greece, Serbia, Egypt, the Balkans. Each loss was rationalized as temporary. "We'll reclaim it," they said. But you can't reclaim what you refuse to reform. And as the empire shrank, its pride grew louder. That's the cruel irony of history. The weaker a power becomes, the more loudly it insists on its importance. In the late 1800s, Sultan Abdulhamid II rose as a last hope. Intelligent, devout, cautious, he understood that the empire was running out of time. He tried to centralize authority, expand education, and modernize the army. But he also ruled through fear and surveillance, turning suspicion into policy. His reign became a strange hybrid. Progress wrapped in paranoia. He believed he could protect the empire by controlling every thought, every reform, every voice. But control is not the same as coherence. The empire needed a new foundation. Instead, it got an anxious guardian. Meanwhile, the world around it was rewriting the rules. Steamships, telegraphs, factories. Europe had industrialized its power. The Ottomans, still debating over loyalty and lineage, were now competing against machines and markets. It was a battle already lost, and yet the empire kept performing. Parades, decrees, festivals, all to project vitality. But performance cannot produce reality. Behind every speech about revival was another loan, another concession, another fragment of independence sold to stay alive a little longer. The empire had become addicted to symbolic strength, mistaking visibility for vitality. The same mistake nations and institutions still make today. They post progress while hiding debt. They announce vision while mortgaging the future. They confuse applause for approval. In the end, even the Sultan's intelligence couldn't outthink entropy. The empire had lost its ability to reinvent. And once that happens, the end is only a matter of timing. By the early 20th century, the empire was surrounded by forces it could no longer understand. Nationalism was rising, technology was accelerating, and the world was shifting from empires to nations. But the Ottomans were still playing the old imperial game. Faith as glue, grandeur as armor, denial as strategy. The First World War became the final test. The empire joined the wrong side, driven by desperation rather than strategy, and paid the final price. When the guns fell silent, 6 centuries of rule ended, not with glory but with paperwork. The Treaty of Sèvres carved the Ottoman world like a map in a banker-s office, each line drawn by foreign hands. The caliphate, the symbol of divine continuity, was now an administrative inconvenience. What centuries of armies couldn't destroy, interest, arrogance, and inertia finally did. The final mirage had vanished, and yet the Ottoman story doesn't end in shame. It ends in revelation. Because in their decline lies a mirror for every modern power that thinks it immune to the same fate. The Ottoman warning is not about history. It's about human nature, power blinds, wealth softens, debt chains. And when identity becomes the last defense against change, collapse becomes the only teacher left. If the Ottoman Empire were to rise today, it wouldn't look like a sultan in silk robes. It would look like a superpower with skyscrapers instead of minarets, digital banks instead of bazaars, and citizens scrolling through screens instead of walking through markets. The language changes, but the psychology doesn't. The same forces that hollowed out the longest empire in history, luxury, comfort, debt, and denial, are alive today, dressed in modern clothes. We call them consumer confidence, economic stimulus, lifestyle inflation. But underneath the jargon, it's the same story. The belief that prosperity can be borrowed, that wealth without work is sustainable, and that comfort will last forever. The Ottomans believed it. So did Rome. So did every civilization that confused momentum with immortality. History doesn't repeat word for word. It repeats in rhythm. The beat is always the same. Expansion, luxury, borrowing, collapse. Only the instruments change. The modern world floats on invisible credit. Not gold, not silver, but faith. Faith in digital numbers and markets and promises. Central banks print money as easily as scribes once inked imperial decrees. Corporations, nations, and households alike build towers of obligation, one loan on top of another, certain that tomorrow will always be richer than today. It is the same illusion that lulled the Ottomans to sleep, that growth will save us from gravity. But every chart has its peak. Every empire, financial or political, eventually meets its limit. The Ottomans learned that debt doesn't destroy you suddenly. It sedates you slowly. You keep functioning, but not freely. You keep living, but under someone else's rules. Sound familiar? Today, nations compete to devalue their own currencies just to stay competitive. Consumers trade privacy for convenience. Corporations trade ethics for scale. The psychology of borrowing, of taking a piece of the future to soothe the present, has become the defining feature of modern civilization. The Ottomans called it istiklal, loss of independence. We call it globalization. But the substance is the same. Sovereignty traded for security. When a state, a company, or even an individual can no longer live without constant inflows of borrowed energy, whether money, data, or validation, freedom becomes fiction. The story of debt has simply moved from palaces to platforms. The new foreign lenders are not British or French bankers. They're global markets, venture funds, and algorithms measuring credit scores instead of collecting taxes. The empire still stands, only now it's digital. And the new sultans? They sit behind screens, not thrones. Yet the warning is the same. When money becomes meaningless, the system starts to eat itself. The Ottomans thought wealth was proof of divine favor. We think it's proof of intelligence. Both beliefs are equally fatal. Because when success becomes self-justifying, no one questions the foundation it stands on. The empire borrowed because it could. So do we. The markets keep expanding, the debt keeps climbing, and everyone tells the same comforting lie. That this time, it's different. But it never is. The instruments change. The melody doesn't. The fall never begins with disaster. It begins with justification. Just a temporary measure. Just to stabilize the economy. Just to keep things running. The Ottomans said the same before defaulting. And when the crash finally came, no one saw it as the end, until it was. The deeper truth is that civilizations don't collapse because they run out of money. They collapse because they run out of meaning. Debt is just the symptom. The disease is disconnection. From purpose, from reality, from restraint. When individuals start consuming more than they create, when governments start borrowing more than they build, when societies start rewarding appearance over substance, history starts humming that familiar tune. The Ottomans danced to it with tulips and silk. We dance to it with tech stocks and luxury brands. Different stage, same choreography. But history is not prophecy. The point of remembering isn't to predict, it's to perceive. The Ottoman fall is not a distant tragedy, it's a mirror. It reminds us that civilizations don't die because of enemies. They die because they forget what made them alive. And if you listen carefully, you can already hear the same silence today. The silence of forgetting that comes right before decline. Every empire imagines it's different. The Romans believed their laws would outlive the world. The British thought their sun would never set. The Ottomans believed their faith and structure would anchor eternity. And today, we think technology, democracy, and data will save us from the same fate. But the truth is colder and older. Civilizations don't collapse because they fail to adapt technologically. They collapse because they fail to adapt psychologically. They forget that the human heart, not machines, not armies, not currencies, is the true engine of endurance. When humility fades, history returns. The Ottoman Empire lasted over 600 years, not because it was perfect, but because it had rhythm, a balance between faith and pragmatism, expansion and restraint, ambition and accountability. The early sultans knew something we've forgotten. Power is not meant to be possessed. It's meant to be stewarded. Once they forgot that, the countdown began. The same will be true for us. The decline never looks like decline at first. It feels like growth, progress, comfort, until suddenly it doesn't. The Ottomans didn't wake up one morning to find their empire gone. It dissolved slowly, transaction by transaction, indulgence by indulgence, excuse by excuse. The story of their fall isn't just history. It is human nature recorded in slow motion. Because what destroyed them lives in us. The desire for permanence in a world built on change. We crave stability, yet we build it on debt. We worship growth, yet we destroy the soil it grows from. We call it evolution, but it's repetition in disguise. The Ottoman warning is simple but merciless. You can't borrow your way out of decay. You can only remember your way back to balance. The rise of any power, personal, political, or global, begins with discipline. The fall begins with comfort. When consumption replaces contribution, when image outweighs essence, when we mistake wealth for wisdom, history doesn't punish us. It simply resets us. Every generation thinks it's smarter than the last, but the cycles stay the same because the psychology stays the same. The Ottomans thought their debts were temporary. We think our digital age is infinite. Both are stories we tell ourselves to avoid the weight of reality. Yet within their story lies hope, because decline isn't fate, it's feedback. It's the universe whispering that something has gone out of rhythm. The Ottomans remind us that even empires made of marble can crack if they forget their foundation. But they also remind us that collapse is never total. Out of their ruins came renewal, new nations, new philosophies, new identities. The lesson is not to mourn what ends, but to learn what must never be repeated. We stand now in our own golden age, surrounded by abundance, drowning in data, sedated by convenience. But the questions that haunted the sultans should haunt us too. What happens when luxury becomes language? When our comfort demands more than our character can sustain? When we owe not just money, but meaning? The Ottoman story ends where ours begins. It's with a choice. To repeat the rhythm or rewrite it. To keep mistaking prosperity for permanence, or to see that balance, not endless growth, is the real definition of power. Because the truth isn't hidden in their fall. It is hidden in their warning. Greatness isn't destroyed by enemies. It is surrendered to excess. And every time we trade discipline for desire, we make the same silent agreement they did. A contract signed not with ink, but with arrogance. A debt not measured in currency, but in character. The empire that forgot its shadow left behind one message carved across centuries. If you want to endure, remember what you serve. Not luxury, not status, not pride, but rhythm. The balance between having and holding, between faith and reason, between what glitters and what grounds you. The Ottoman story is not about the past, it's about us. And if you've felt the echo, or the rhythm of repetition pulsing beneath our modern noise, then you already know what comes next. The question is whether we'll listen this time, or let history collect again.